facts, figures, and all the rest of it are rough. I've been doing my notes in the last 30 seconds and I haven't got pre-prepared text. It was one of the ideas that we were suggesting to substitute for tomorrow morning, and instead, and I think it's the best idea, that we go for the formation of the CPGB, because then we can talk about, I think, what haunts the contemporary left, and that's the lack of the party. Anyway, I'll forgive anybody who wants to leave. I can understand why. This is what we advertised, and instead you're getting a very impromptu discussion. But I think it's an important and it's a very useful discussion nonetheless. Okay, I mean, let's just begin with Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to go on about Black Lives Matter, except to say here was a spontaneous movement. It was, most intense and most important in the United States, but it took on global proportions. And one of the things I think that must have struck at least British people looking at the press reports and the TV cameramen was one, the huge proliferation of homemade placards. I think you can really tell a spontaneous movement under those circumstances of where people are making their own placards out of cardboard boxes in the main. And the other thing I think that would strike people is two slogans, and that is, first of all, defund the police, which makes a lot more sense in the United States, given its federal structure and much more localist police force, as opposed to the much more centralised police force that we have in Britain. And the other one, which really must have, hope gets some people thinking, at least in Britain, I don't know about on continental Europe, and that is, the slogan, abolish the police. Now, we in the CPGB have been known in various unity formations to raise the question of abolishing the standing army, and we include the police under that umbrella, and replacing the armed forces of the state with a popular militia. The response that we get in Britain from our comrades on the left, who are purportedly Marxist, is quite frankly dumb incomprehension, or the equivalent that we're advocating. The release of psychopathic murderers onto the streets of Britain with Kalashnikovs in order to mow down people. I think that there's been a huge forgetting in terms of the left and its tradition and its past programmatic pronouncements. I deliberately went out to read The Socialist, that's the weekly publication of the Socialist Party in England and Wales, and Socialist Worker, the paper of the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain, to see what their reaction to these slogans from Black Lives Matter was. And I was, on the one side, completely unsurprised that both organisations were tailing Black Lives Matter and the slogans. So they were basically saying, what, abolish the police, we too want to abolish the police. But then when you actually read the editorials and comment pieces, what you found is that this abolition was to come after the abolition of capitalism. So what they then explained is, under under a socialist society, of course, you wouldn't have a police force that's separate from the population. What you'd have is some sort of self-policing by the population. To me, that puts the cart before the horse. Why? Because you have to ask the question, okay, so if you're called to abolish the standing army and the armed might of the bourgeoisie comes after you've won, how do you expect to win and protect your victory? Even if we take it on the most banal level of left labourism. Okay, so you get your parliamentary majority and then you pass legislation under those circumstances to abolish the army and the police force. Meanwhile, the army has been sent against you and the police force has been sent against you, and you're under arrest. Okay, so in terms of that particular slogan, of course, it has its roots in the Second Amendment to the American Constitution. It also ought to be pointed out that the American radicals that fought for that amendment themselves had a European and also an English tradition. So you can read Magna Carta, you can read the Bill of Rights, Glorious Revolution, and all the rest of it about the right to bear arms. We have no illusions in who that was talking about. It was the gentlemen, the upper classes. Nevertheless, there's also a tradition that seems to have generalized that idea that goes back to Florence and was spread throughout Europe on the basis of the writings of Machiavelli, and not just his writings. He was actually an official in the Florentine Republic and actually established a militia in Florentine, as opposed to the normal situation in Italy of the day to actually hire mercenary armies. As I understand it, Florence did use a mercenary army, and it's often the case, mercenary armies prove to be, fickle, to put it mildly. They didn't go and do what they said. They were more concerned with preserving their own skin. So Machiavelli was responsible for recruiting a militia in Florence. I can't say that it proved particularly militarily effective, but the main point would be, in a number of Machiavelli's works, he advocates the popular militia, and we can trace the spread of that idea in terms of radical thinkers through England, over the Atlantic, and into America. But it shouldn't be forgotten either that for Marxists, by the time Marx and Engels got round to the sort of founding documents, I suppose, of Marxism, certainly when it comes to programs such as the Communist Manifesto and the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, which came out the following year, you find this idea of replacing the standing army with a popular militia, the armed people. So if we look at the classic programs of social democracy, the Second International, you'll find this idea in the Gotha program, you'll find it in the Erfurt program, you'll find it in the program of the French Workers' Party, the program that was written in Engels's front room in Primrose Hill in London. Interestingly, you'll also find it in the Labour Party's first manifesto in 1900. Clearly, the founders of the Labour Party were influenced, by continental Marxism. They weren't Marxist, but nonetheless they were influenced by that. And I would guess, and I haven't gone and researched it, but I'd also guess that they were also influenced by the more general radical common sense of the 18th and 19th century. So again, looking at the British tradition, I think it's worthwhile recalling that the Chartist movement championed the idea of a popular militia, and certainly when we had Sir Robert Peel founding the modern police force, that's a professional police force, a centralised police force over London, and how that was rolled out over Britain, a very different police force to the one that had previously existed. The old police force was locally controlled, tended to be controlled inevitably by the squirearchy. Supposedly every adult male between whatever and whatever was meant to do their service in the local police force. If you were well off, you simply paid someone, and the people that you tended to pay were ne'er-do-wells, physically unfit, often drunks, and very ineffective in catching criminals or doing much else. And that mattered then because what we had, as I said before, is Chartism, the foundation of the first modern Workers' Party. But also what you had is the local authorities trying to control mass Chartist demonstrations, both in London, but also on a regional basis. Certainly if we think back a few years to Peterloo in Manchester, we all know the story there, that you had a demonstration in favour of extending the suffrage. I think it was a demand for universal male suffrage, a hugely radical demand in 1819. I think I've got the date right. And of course what the local authorities did is send in, how should I put it, what do they call the dragoons, locally recruited dragoons. This consisted of the squirearchy and people in their pay, and we all know the story of Peterloo, how they hacked people down. A whole number of people were killed, but hundreds of people were injured. And one of the things that recommended the police, the modern police, the peelers, to the capitalist class is that demonstrations, law and order was more easily controlled through the police baton bashing someone over the head than by dragoons and their sabres. Also, in terms of actually maintaining, controlling thievery, the modern police force, the peelers, were certainly more effective by those that were commonly called in Britain at the time, or in England at the time, the Charlies. I think it was established, this other militia or this other police force was established, I presume, under the reign of Charles II. Anyway, what I want to do is just, how much time? So we're 11 minutes past. We'll see. I wouldn't aim to speak beyond past, Kevin, if that's okay. So what I want to do now is turn to both the program and example of the Russian Revolution. Because certainly for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, I don't know enough about the Mensheviks on this one. The idea of arming the working class was something that existed in their very origins, and obviously that came to fruition in 1905, and the December Revolution most fiercely fought out in Moscow. Worthwhile adding just a little note on that this employed barricade fighting, but not barricade fighting of the sort that was seen in the French Revolution of 1789 or even 1871. I think you can find the military writings of Engels where he declares that those sort of tactics as being out of date, given cannons, and especially in Paris after 1871, they actually rebuild the city to make the use of cannons more effective. I'm also told, this is again very much an aside, so forgive me, I'm also told that Istanbul was redesigned to facilitate the use of tanks against the civilian population. Either way, what they did is they used barricade fighting, but instead of the left, the Bolsheviks and their anarchist allies lining up behind the barricades, they fought from the streets, they fought hit and run. But what we need to understand is, of course, they were up against Tsarist troops, and I don't think that they succeeded in breaking the discipline of those troops. Clearly, World War I created different conditions compared with the Japanese-Russian War, and what you saw there is the breakdown of military discipline towards the end of the rule of the Tsar. The Tsar collapses, and military discipline, certainly in the two capital cities, is fatally undermined. I remember the discussion from a day or so ago, talking about the United Front and Lars's talk as well, and the situation there that Petrograd Soviet actually takes upon itself the constitutional authority, that it must be in a position to countersign all military orders. So in terms if an offensive was going to be ordered, that had to be countersigned by the Soviets. If troops were going to be moved to the front, that had to be countersigned by the Soviet. Anyway, it wasn't only the army that underwent disintegration and fell out of the tight control of the state. Obviously, there's a difference between Petrograd and Moscow and the front, and a difference between that and regiments in the south. But it wasn't only the army that, how should I put it, fell out of control. Also, the police force disintegrated. We need to understand about the Tsarist police. They definitely were of the dragoon type, i.e. They weren't employing the methods of the British peelers. They were much more of the tradition of the old English dragoons, i.e. they would carry sabres and they would use sabres on demonstrators or shoot demonstrators. As a result of that, they were certainly hated with a passion. I'm not suggesting for a second that the peelers weren't hated. They were recognised by the Chartist movement, by the radical movement, as an instrument much less to control crime and preserve, the life and limb of the citizenry. They were seen much more as an instrument of counter-revolution against those demanding universal male suffrage. And I think if I'm right, there was a reasonably famous incident of where the police were sent in to disperse a very moderate reform meeting. A policeman was killed, and a jury actually found that was justified homicide, so hated were the police force. Anyway, my main point is the police force in Moscow and crucially Petrograd disintegrates, and what we see is the formation of two alternate armed forces, and that is the ones that are seen as a replacement police force that is promoted by the Mensheviks and the right-wing socialist revolutionaries and the cadets. And then what you see is the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard sees its task to keep law and order in the locality, but as the name suggests, also to protect the revolution. And out of them and alongside them, we also see the emergence of the Red Guards. The Red Guards are marginal until after the Kornilov attempted coup. We all know the role of the Bolsheviks and basically how after that they go on to score victory after victory, both in Soviet elections but also in local council and district elections. And what happens under those circumstances is that the Red Guards mushroom. And if you read Lenin's writings in the summer and autumn of 1917, he's quite clear. Of course, he welcomes this development. Many of these, either Revolutionary Guards, certainly the Revolutionary Guard and the Red Guard. Lots of them were under the influence of the Bolsheviks. Lots of them were passing Bolshevik-sponsored resolutions. But Lenin actually says, well, the thing about these workers' militia, these Red Guards, is they are a prelude to the general arming of the population. Something that he spoke about, of course, in State and Revolution, but also way back and consistently throughout the history of the Bolsheviks, going back, to 1903, into two tactics of social democracy and all the rest of it. So, in other words, he wasn't counterposing the Red Guards against a popular militia. He saw the Red Guards precisely as one of the means to actually win the rule of a workers' and peasants' government, all power to the Soviets, a Bolshevik government, in other words. Of course, the role of the army was also crucial. We all know that the Petrograd Soviet established a revolutionary committee against Kornilov, but also this was the committee under Trotsky, of course, that issued the orders to change the guard, not to send troops to the front, and to arrest the provisional government and storm the Winter Palace. I know it's an old story, but in case anyone hasn't heard it, I've told it too many bloody 100 times, I know, comrades, so apologies. But of course, famously, more people were killed in Eisenstein's reenactment of the storming of the Winter Palace. Anyone who hasn't seen the film October, go and see it. I think that was produced in 1918 to mark the 10th anniversary. I don't think it quite came out on time. I think it was 1928. Anyway, I could be wrong. The main point would be that if you look at the reenactment of it, it's heroic, it's dramatic. People are climbing up gates, guns are going off all over the place. I'm sure they were not real. Nonetheless, more people were killed in the reenactment of it than in the actual event itself. The actual event itself was a pretty low-key affair, and we're told that when Lenin came back from his Finnish exile and was taken around the newly liberated city of Petrograd, he said, well, you tell me there's been a revolution, I don't see any evidence of it. And Trotsky, I think, did describe it, at least in Petrograd, as much more having the character of changing the guard. In other words, we have the slogan, Chartist slogan, the physical force Chartist slogan of peacefully if we can, forcefully if we must. In Petrograd, they could do it peacefully, and they could do it peacefully because they had the Red Guard, because the police had been dispersed, because the regiments and the rank and file were electing their own officers, because the Soviets had the constitution, unwritten constitutional right, and they exercised it to countersign or issue their own orders to loyal troops to the revolution, loyal troops to the Soviets. Okay, so just to wrap up, I really just want to sort of think out loud of, and ask the question of why, at least in Britain, I'd be interested to hear from comrades in the United States and in mainland Europe if it's the same for you. But as I said before in my opening, when we raise in our draft program and when we raise that in front of other organizations, the demand to abolish the standing army, abolish the police, to organize a popular militia, we get giggles or attempts basically to shut us down. It's viewed seriously as some sort of crazy obsession. What was viewed as the norm in the 19th century and the norm in the 18th century is now viewed as crazy. Well, my explanation is sort of twofold, I suppose, and that is on the one side, the integration of the Labour Party into the state. In 1900, that was an open-ended question. So when the Labour Party affiliated to the Second International in 1908, Lenin certainly talked about the Labour Party being a step towards a real workers' party. Kautsky thought it sort of already was. Lenin definitely didn't agree with that, but thought nonetheless that life would teach and it would make the transition to genuine socialism, i.e. Marxism. But, of course, with World War I, with the coalition government, with the first Labour government, I think what you get with the Labour Party is it sort of goes from being a bourgeois workers' party to a bourgeois workers' party. The bourgeois wing of it also becomes a state party. This becomes an alternative party of government. And indeed, in the 1920s, it emerges as the alternative party of government to the Conservative Party. Marx and Engels famously thought that with the emergence of the Labour Party, or a Labour Party, which they thought was inevitable in Britain, that what would happen is that the bourgeoisie would stick with the great Liberal Party. That was the traditional party of the bourgeoisie, and the Tory party, the party of the landed aristocracy, that would die. Of course, the opposite happened. It was the great Liberal Party that died. It split. The trade unionists split off from supporting Liberal MPs and Liberal candidates, and the Labour Party ceased being a tail of the Liberal Party and constituted itself as an independent, not of the bourgeoisie, but independent of the Liberal Party. Anyway, my main point is that I can sort of understand, therefore, if you are a state bourgeois workers' party, how you would want to forget all about your earlier common sense of replacing the standing army. The Labour Party not only abandoned that common sense at home, it also made it its own common sense to take the empire, the British Empire, for granted, something that the Labour Party would defend, of course, with the usual stuff about educating the natives and being good for people and all the rest of it. But what about the radical left? What about official communism? Well, they certainly have the illusion. If you read the old program of official communism, the British Road to Socialism, which was authored jointly by Stalin What you had there, I don't know whether you want to describe that as either cynically or naively. If it was written by Stalin, surely it has to be cynically. But you have this idea that you would have a communist Labour government, and under those circumstances, the idea was that so constitutional were the police, were the army, were MI5, so law-abiding were the secret services and the bourgeoisie, that you really wouldn't face any sort of slave owners' rebellion. And the idea would be that the army would do its job, protect the country abroad, and the police force would do its job locally, and there you are, no problem. But it's amazing, isn't it, that you find that basically the same perspective with Socialist Party in England and Wales, and before it militant tendency, but you also find it with those from an SWP tradition, and also, it has to be said, those that view themselves still as loyal adherents of Trotsky's 1938 transitional program. And my explanation there is that what they take from the 1938 transitional program is not the passages where Trotsky raises up how the workers will arm themselves on picket lines and take on the police and move towards the Soviets. What you get is a decay in that, and the dressing up of the most minimal economic demands and their revolutionization. That as long as you raise up any sort of demand and get any sort of a following, that this automatically somehow takes you to socialism. And you don't want to frighten people by being too advanced. So what you do, you reflect existing consciousness, and you don't scare people, about what your real aims are. I think that's the politics of desperation. I think that that's the politics of dishonesty. And I think that if we look back to the 19th century, when you had mass parties of social democracy, and in the early 20s, mass parties of the Third International, people can be inspired in their millions by the honest truth that these are our aspirations and these are our methods to achieve that end. Because in my view, the idea that you're going to get socialism in Britain or anywhere else guarded by the equivalent of the British Bobby or the British Tommy is illusory. Our job, yes, is to raise demands in the police for proper trade unionism, the same in the army, but our aim is to win over regiments to our side with a view to ending the standing army and going over to a militia system, which is pretty useless when it comes to foreign wars, pretty effective when it comes to defending the country. I'm not going to go on about Trotsky's Red Army and Lenin's idea of revolutionary war across Europe. That's outside the remit of this talk, and I've overrun by 1 minute, so humble apologies. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Okay, I've indicated in the chat column the usual format, which is that if you want to take part in the discussion, ask a question, make a comment, then you can either do that by clicking on the participants button and going on to raise hand, or you can put your name into the chat box, which again you'll find on your you'll find underneath your panel. So at the moment, I haven't got any comrades indicating to come in. I'd like to thank Jack for stepping in at the very last minute and did an excellent job of raising some questions. Okay, well, I've just got Daniel Lazare And Daniel is, let's just get him here. Okay, Daniel, you can come in now.
Okay. Thanks very much for the talk. It raises a lot of very important questions about not only what the demand should be, but when to introduce them, and how exactly to lead the masses along or persuade them to pursue a revolutionary road. But one point I want to emphasize. Jack mentioned the Second Amendment here in the United States. The Second Amendment confers an individual right to bear arms. It's not a workers' militia. It's not even a colonial militia that existed in 1775 at the Battle of Concord and Lexington. It's an individual right. So we have people in the United States who are stockpiling all kinds of arms, AR-15s, Kalashnikovs, even heavier weaponry, believe it or not. And these people parade about with their personal arms. Occasionally, they engage in mass slaughters, massacres. They invade schoolhouses and mow down elementary school children. It's not a good thing, and it's clearly a reactionary expression in that it's an attempt to reach back to the 1776. Sorry, hold on. Just 1 second, sorry. To reach back to the American Revolution, turn the clock back, somehow reawaken those bourgeois revolutionary impulses. And it's just miles apart from any concept of a workers' militia or a workers' Red Guard. I mean, in 1936, when the fascist rebellion broke out in Spain, workers seized military arsenals, but they didn't seize it in the name of individual ownership of those weapons. They seized it in the name of collective working class ownership of those weapons. So that's my only point. The Second Amendment, I think, expresses an entirely reactionary concept of weapon ownership, and it should not be confused with a modern socialist concept of workers' militia. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Dan. The next speaker is Gus Autas. My apologies for the pronunciation.
Yeah, you butchered it. Yeah, Jack, you asked about the response of the left in mainland Europe to the questions of militia, right to bear arms, those kind of questions, and so I thought I'd respond. Yeah, I think a lot of it is very similar. A lot of what you see when the left is putting forward demands like revolution, like one solution, revolution. There's totally no content to it. And at one point you said the left forgets its history. I think, and there is a lot of history here. Like the first legislation banning the right to bear arms in the Netherlands was in 1919. Well, you can imagine why. But I think they don't forget their history. I think they deliberately choose to forget the history. Whenever we have put forward the demand here, a lot of the response you get is the time just isn't right to put forward these kind of demands, or some giggling, or even just getting angry at us for even saying such violent things at all. So yeah, I think the response is very similar. You also said at one point that it could be that it has gone away on the left because of becoming a governmental party. I just grabbed this book from my bookshelf. It's basically a collection of the Dutch Social Democratic program starting in the 1890s to 1977, and I couldn't locate it that quickly, but I think the moment it got scrapped from the program and where right to bear arms and for militia got replaced was 1937, just before the war. Of course, 2 years after that, they would join the government, very shortly lived because of the war, of course. But, there's probably a point there that had to do with it wanting to become a party of government, and the program changed it to the danger of war should be combated by having international rule of law, which is just terrible. You also talked about defund the police, abolish the police demand, which I think is a bit problematic, the demand in and of itself, because it doesn't answer any questions. It doesn't solve any questions. It doesn't tell us what to do as a workers' movement against police brutality, but also just in and of itself, defending ourselves, preparing ourselves for taking power. Instead, it leaves a lot open, which I think will in practice just lead to, especially in America, like Pinkerton armies and private police, because the workers' movement didn't put forward any alternative. I'm also interested in the question of the difference between individual weapon ownership and collective ownership. It's a debate we have amongst ourselves. Of course, we aren't legalists, so just because it isn't allowed to bear arms doesn't mean we can't bear arms, like as a collective, as a workers' movement, as a union. But still, I think it's an interesting question how we would put forward the demand and avoid giving the power to the bourgeois state to decide what will be a collective or who will be able to bear arms, which is not the power I want to give the bourgeois state. That's it.
Dank u wel, Gus. The next speaker is Mike McNair.
Yeah, thanks, John, for stepping in at the absolute bleeding last minute to fill in. So I'm not going to disagree with you on these things, but I've got a number of little bits in it. The first is that there was a militia in this country. The issue about whether there should be a militia in this country and what the relationship of the militia to the standing army and so on and so forth was, it's actually in already in the Bill of Rights 1689, that the raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it be with consent of Parliament, is against law. And that's Article 6 and Article 7, that subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defence suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. And background to that is that the regime of Charles II and then of James II had seized equipment from Whig noblemen, weapons along the scale of the equipment for a whole regiment of cavalry and a whole regiment of infantry and 3 or 4 pieces of artillery that Lord Delamere had in his capacious property. So it's about the right of the bourgeoisie to overthrow the pre-capitalist state. That's why that comes in, and I guess that the reality is that's actually why it appears in the Bill of Rights in the American Bill of Rights. Yeah, I agree that with Dan Lazare that the right in the American Bill of Rights is an individual right. The same is true of the right in the English Bill of Rights. It's an individual right because the English Bill of Rights is not an entrenched constitution, and Firearms Act 1920, passed because of a Bolshevik scare, repeals pro tanto the English Bill of Rights. That said, as I said, there was a militia, and it went on being a subject of debate, that there should be a militia rather than a standing army militia, as well as a standing army serious general conscript militia training. And then on top of the conscript militia, which you had reactivated in the 1750s and went on through till the late 19th century. You had volunteer forces of the yeomanry, which were the guys who did the Beetaloo massacres, the hunting classes, gentlemen on horseback with swords, etc. But in the late 19th century, volunteer forces were formed, again, in this case, not from the hunting classes, but from the upper middle classes in the towns. And I think it's a remote reflection. What happened to it essentially was that the militia proper became centralised under central government control and bureaucratic management. Then the bits of the militia were mobilised in 1914, so that the British, part of the British Army was militia-based, but it was turned into regular forces. And then a new militia was created in the form of the Home Guard, but again on a volunteer basis in 1940. It says something, I guess. I was at school, at a private school in the late 1960s, well, in the 1960s through early 1970s, and unless you were conscientious objector, you were required to be a member of the school cadet force and do rifle training and training in military tactics. And to be honest, it seems to me that it's the this is paradoxically, it's the upper classes being given that right, reflecting the fact it's private schools. But it's actually what Engels proposed in his article, Can Europe Disarm? That the way to the militia is through universal military training in schools, not primarily through volunteer operations. Just on the police before the peelers, I put up the justifiable homicide. There's also actually a case in 1709 where the court ruled that where a policeman made an unlawful arrest, to kill the policeman was manslaughter and not murder, because it's provocation to violate constitutional rights by making an unlawful arrest. And that was still followed in the 1740s in relation to the press gang, but was abandoned. In the press gang was the guys who conscripted sailors arbitrarily off the street for the Royal Navy. It was abandoned, I guess, because of the issues about the press gang in the 1760s. But I think it's reasonably clear that the peelers, the London street police force, was indeed, it was about public order, as John said. And the conscript constabulary, it's not actually true that people, it's true that the rich, relatively rich, it wasn't actually the upper classes who were conscripted into being constables, it was the middle classes, but the upper end of that hired a substitute. The fact was there was guys who were in regular practice of selling themselves out as substitutes. They were called, they were referred to as thief takers. There was a private whole business of private detection and prosecution, which was also associated with people in conspiracy with the criminals to handle stuff like that. So that this stuff, it's not that it was, it's not that the control of ordinary theft and assault and battery and stuff like that, wounding, was being done by the new constabulary. They weren't bloody doing it. Actually, the point at which we move into its being dominated police prosecution for this stuff is late 20th century. So that the idea that disbanding the police force would get rid of, would mean that there was no dealing with crime is a nonsense. It would just mean that you didn't have a public order force, and then you have to accustom yourself back again to normally private detection and private prosecution, and perhaps yes, through the workers' movement organising itself to deal with these questions. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Mike.